Welcome to another philosophical conversation. I'm Cadell Last here with Julie Reshe, and Julie is first and foremost a pathetic failure, but she's also a Ukrainian-born philosopher and author of both the negative psychoanalytic approach as well as a book we're going to talk about today, Negative Psychoanalysis for the Living Dead. She earned her PhD studying psychoanalysis at the Research Center of the Slovenian Academy of the Sciences and Arts, studying under the supervision of Alenka Zupancic. At the present, she holds a position of a visiting professor at the University College of Cork and the University College of London. And she is also the director of the Institute of Psychoanalysis, Global Center for Advanced Studies. So welcome, Julie. And my first question in light of this introduction is, why should we think about you as a pathetic failure?
Thank you for introducing me and for having me here. Well, you don't have to, but just the way I think about myself, and I'm just trying to be honest about it, it sets the mood. You see you smiling for some reason. It's not funny. But that's when I'm honest with myself, I guess that's how I perceive myself. And no matter what, no matter everything else that you listed, that I would normally list about myself when I'm asked to represent myself would not get just an escape, a failure of escape from the failure I am. I don't think it's only about me. I think it's how genuinely human beings feel. We do tend to feel about ourselves, and we're just trying to escape it, but without any luck. Do you feel it about yourself?
Yeah, no, I mean, if I was gonna go into it, there was certainly, I would say there was a big shift in my life. Not sure if I could pinpoint the age, but there was certainly a shift in my life where perhaps it was awareness of the unconscious, but where there was this, I guess, inescapability of negativity. And I suppose, yes, that if I was thinking about self-reflection of my life and myself in a day-to-day basis, um, this feeling of suffering, this feeling of negativity is dominant. So and that has come to shape my own personal philosophy. So in the sense of putting categories like negativity, pain, suffering, tragedy as front and center is something I resonate with, and it comes out strongly, of course, in your work, and maybe we can just start there very simply in terms of how should we understand generally this negative approach in contrast to positive approaches and popular psychology in general.
Also, the being philosopher is probably being a failure to some extent, because philosophy is where you, or at least it's a nurturing space for this negativity, for the tragedy of life. Because if you end up, if you're disillusioned in everything, and you still end up where you end up, the place, you can still call it a philosophy. So if there is nothing left except for depression, anxiety, and recognition of tragedy of existence, so if you end up nowhere, you're still ending up within philosophy. You can call yourself philosopher. So it's kind of impossible on one hand to fail within philosophy. If you're philosopher, you are still philosopher, and you maybe to some extent successful within your anxiety, thinking only, being, when anxiety is the only thing is left, you're still philosopher. So it's I'm lucky to be philosopher. Otherwise, whoever you are, if you're a politician or if you are, well, maybe a poet, it's okay too. You can fail as much as you want. You still remain a poet. But any other profession or any other occupation in your life, if you fail, you fail. But philosophy is a place where you, religion maybe to some extent, poetry to some extent, art too. There are spaces that we might call negative spaces. Unlike the outwardly, maybe the space of our cultural space, which is positively oriented, where we kind of pretend that life is a successful project, or we get in some kind of success in certain profession. Those are other dimensions that you can be a failure, and it's okay.
I like that you emphasize their philosophy, art, religion, poetry as sort of the dimensions of these negative spaces in contrast to positivity or life as a successful project. What do you think it is about those dimensions in particular that open up to a negative space?
Um, I don't know. I also think that maybe they're not spaces. Maybe we see them as alternative to positive spaces, but they're not actually alternative. They're not actually the opposite, because the other spaces is also spaces of failure, because human life is a failure in itself, and it just pretend we just able to maintain better the illusion of success maybe in other spheres, and here you don't there are less requirements of maintaining this illusion. You can be uh, a failure you want to be, or a failure you're ending up to be. There is more freedom of that.
I mean, what's coming to my mind just thinking about this distinction between, life as a successful project, positive, and then, when I was thinking about my life and my projects when I was more in that mindset, um, in paradoxically perhaps, measuring myself up against the idea of a successful project, I would feel very negative when I was when I perceived myself as a failure. Like, for example, I failed high school. For example, the first time I applied for university, I didn't get in. This was very painful, but I was conceiving myself in a positive project at the time. However, when you go into, say, philosophy or art or religion and go into these negative spaces, is it possible to get a different perspective on failure in your view, or is it you just broaden the concept of failure?
I also think that maybe there are two dimensions, the negative and the positive one within everything. So the book that I wrote, and generally my worldview, somewhat similar to depressive realism, position of depressive realism, that depression is actually gives you more realistic point of view, except for depressive realism. I think it's not depressive enough because it still gives something like realistic view. But any dimension of existence, or any profession, or for example, religion or psychoanalysis or philosophy, they probably have positive dimension, like dimension of escaping depressive reality. You can have salvation in religion, in psychoanalysis you can have treatment or whatever, something successful with a good end. And in philosophy you can have explanation, in science you can have everything explained. But there are also, in all of those spheres, there's also what I think is sacred dimension, negative dimension where all of those positivity, successfulness fails. In religion, the negative core, we can call it the absence of knowledge, the absence of salvation. In philosophy, the more confusion, well, also non-knowledge. In science, well, science doesn't fail. If it fails, it's not science, it turns into philosophy. Or so in all of those, in psychoanalysis, my favorite type of psychoanalysis, the negative psychoanalysis, is psychoanalysis that recognizes itself as a failure, as treatment of a failure, disillusioned in itself. And this is what I find genuine human psychoanalysis, the genuine recognition of the negative core of itself as being a failure.
I mean, let's maybe start there then with, obviously this book is about psychoanalysis. It's obviously not about philosophy. It's not about art. It's not about religion. And it's specifically about psychoanalysis, coming from the Freudian tradition, and deeply sort of engaging Freud. And at least in my reading of your reading of Freud, there's this critical break with the Freud of the death drive versus the Freud before the death drive, basically. Maybe could you explain a little bit what you think is going on in Freud's work before the death drive, and what changes in Freud's disposition, and perhaps some reasons why there was this change after the discovery of the death drive?
I would just trace partially because it's convenient, the switch from the positive, so to say, Freud that is familiar to our therapeutic culture, to therapism and culture of pop psychology, of self-help, the culture of positivity, to later Freud after 1920, after Freud after Beyond the Pleasure Principle, who recognizes the centrality of the death drive and who becomes disillusioned in psychoanalytic cure. So it doesn't work. And partially or substantially, actually, it's the influence of Sabina Spielrein, and I regret not mentioning her enough in my work. But it's only a matter of convenience, and I'm not that interested, to be honest, in, even though the book is about negative psychoanalysis, but for me, word negative is main here in comparison to psychoanalysis. So it's not that I'm trying to discover the genuine Freud, even though I think it's not only genuine Freud, but any genuine human being. But there is more a matter of convenience to trace this difference, just to show it maybe as an example, this distinction of genuine psychoanalysis, Freud as failure, psychoanalysis as failure within generally what appears to be generally positive project of psychoanalysis. It's not that I'm interested in psychoanalysis, it's just and not that I see myself as a researcher on Freud and I'm discovering something in Freud. It doesn't matter that much. It's more as an example of this dimension that I see as genuine and that I'm interested in.
And do you think that Freud, I guess I know you're trying to point it away from Freud in psychoanalysis, but do you feel like there was a genuineness that comes out at the end of Freud that's not there at the beginning of the analytic project? And I guess I'm asking this because personally I'm going into teaching the Écrit, Lacan's Écrit, and in the Écrit, it seems to me like Lacan shares the importance of this distinction of Freud before and after the Beyond the Pleasure Principle. And he seems to be, in my interpretation, pulling something out of this moment of Freud, which has been either repressed or obfuscated in the institutional psychoanalytic schools. So not sure if, basically the question is there something more genuine that comes out at the end of Freud?
Yeah, I think so. Maybe not even only Freud, but humans over their life as they grow, as they encounter more and more tragedies, and they lose hope. Not maybe all of us, but it's probably what is happening. And there's maybe more negativity, acceptance of negativity. And it is common distinction of late Freud and of early Freud and late Freud. But it's still, I wouldn't say that, for example, late Freud discovered, even though I claim in the book that he had the negative insight that is not actually insight, but more like blindness or disillusionment in the aim to success, something like that. Because if the initial aim was psychoanalytic cure, then it is a failure, and he recognizes it's a failure, but actually not fully, because until the end of his life, he's trying to see even the death drive, put it back into the project of the pleasure principle. It's just a matter of convenience. Even Sabina Spielrein, who I think is more devoted and who, to her, the idea of death drive belong actually to her. I think she can be also interpreted as negative and positive, we can say. And maybe to add to this, that we tend to, it's not that I'm trying to discover some kind of knowledge in Freud and in Lacan. Well, it's harder in Lacan, right, to discover something. It just, and it's not that I see myself as a follower of Freud or certain type of Freud. I rather see, to be honest, Freud as my predecessor, but it's not because I'm so smart. It's rather the opposite. I'm not smart enough to understand him. Maybe to present some novel interpretation is that I'm trying to say something, that I think at the same time supposed to be said, but at the same time is completely worthless. And I'm borrowing some of the Freud's words or psychoanalytic words or words that and in general, the psychoanalysis, the way philosophical perspective, the way I present it in my book is, to be honest, the psychoanalysis I can tolerate. There's most of the complex concepts I end up not being able to tolerate, and the only one I am is this my psychoanalysis, my space of there's still otherwise everything else I would renounce.
In that sense, I mean, what you have a practice, you have an analytic practice. How does your practice differ from even conventional, let's say, Freudian or Lacanian approaches to therapy? If we even want to use that, should I even use that word?
Well, you can use word therapy, even though there are different ways to interpret what therapy is. And in conventional understanding and etymologically, therapy could mean different things. It can mean, on one hand, treatment and cure, but which is more widespread understanding of therapy. But it can also mean something closer to care. And care, in my view, is closer to how would I interpret what I do. Care meaning without offering a hope of salvation of something like that, just staying there in this negativity and staying in a place of non-knowledge, discovering the failure that the other person is. So not offering hope, not offering treatment, and not offering consolation. And I see it as a genuine, first of all, human space, but also space of experiment, of not knowing what to do, of not having protocol, of not offering promise of treatment. So on one hand, it's opposite to practice understood as therapy. But if you take into account alternative understanding of therapy, then you might call it therapy or practice in this way.
I'm tempted here to make a connection with things I've learned about hospice care. I mean, of course, the subtitle of the book is For the Living Dead. And so I get this idea that therapy, and now this is just an idea I'm trying to pull out, that therapy is more oriented towards life, potentially helping you live better. Of course, a hospice is so that you can prepare to get care, to accept death as inevitable. Mm-hmm. Am I right to sort of say that there's a connection here to hospice care?
Yeah, I really like this definition. Well, you can think of it as end of life care, the one where you don't, which is perceived normally in a medical discourse. You would claim that there is that it's normally oriented towards cure, right? And everything that is about care or care workers or nurses, they're seen as a secondary stuff, even though their work is much harder because precisely there is no hope there. We don't want to see it as crucial because it's harder because they actually have to witness something that deprived of hope. So I would call it end of life care, but also palliative measure, because basically any measure, because life is going to end. Palliative, just you can turn life into a successful project, and no healing will help because it will end bad. And it's not only at the end of the life, but it's death operating on us every second in many dimensions.
I mean, I'm tempted here to move to. Well, first, I like that you sort of receptive to this idea of the hospice, because it's an interesting way to think about your project, almost as in between, at least in my head, in between therapy and at least psychoanalytic practice, and what probably should get more attention is end of life care, but as you're bringing up, sort of care for the moment to moment pressure of death. Throughout the three main chapters, you emphasize that this structural role of death is throughout. I just wanted to maybe touch on briefly what these three major themes are: the individual, the social, and nature in regards to death. Can you give us an overview of what you're trying to point at with this triad?
It was initially Freud's distinction. Well, it's also more or less obvious distinction to show different dimensions of suffering. And I do start the first main chapter deals with individual suffering or death drive of individual. I'm using a lot concept, Malabou's concept of destructive plasticity scene, which is her substitute, her improved version of the death drive. And second chapter deals with suffering and a level of interconnectivity, and level of society, or love or social bond. Suffering is something that connects us at the core of connection, and as death drive as social drive. And the last chapter, third chapter, deals with suffering in nature or in the world or in evolution. Evolution as death driven.
Maybe let's focus on this concept. I think it was maybe the concept that, I'm not sure if it was you or Catherine Malabou who said that destructive plasticity is one of your most favorite concepts, but could you go into what does destructive plasticity mean, and perhaps what is its relationship to both the individual and the common neuroscientific use of the concept plasticity, of brain plasticity?
So it is my favorite concept, as you mentioned. Not sure it's Catherine Malabou's favorite concept, but she definitely knows that it's my favorite concept. And I'm trying to radicalize it, make it more universal, to see it as a general anthropological concept, something that is applicable to every human being. And destructive plasticity is Catherine Malabou. That's why I love it so much. It's better than death drive, because it's, for Catherine Malabou, it's improved version of a death drive, precisely because Freud of a death drive, according to her, is still entangled within the general logic of early Freud, of logic, of positive logic, we can say, of pleasure principle. Everything, even if there is death drive, there is the reason for it. It like works for something, some kind of improvement or some kind of pleasure, which you get at the end out of it. But for Catherine Malabou, destructive plasticity is precisely the substitute that is actually negative, that is just a failure of any of attaining any pleasure, we can say. And it's her also, the topic of her research is to add discourse on neuroscience here, because neuroscience and plasticity, which is a key concept in neuroscience of changeability or transformability of the brain. Catherine Malabou and her general critique would also concern the critique of neuroscience seen as overly positive and not being able to recognize destructivity as a form, as able to form its own forms. So it's only positive formation, something that neuroscience and science in general, being positively oriented, can only see positive formation, and the failure of formation that results in a formation of a form, it's not able to recognize. And I'm trying to add to this neuroscientific discussion.
I mean, I'd like to ask a follow-up question about this idea of the destructivity as forming its own form. I mean, I think I know what you're trying to point at, and I think what you're trying to point at is even maybe like one of the most important things to point at, and maybe it's why it's your favorite concept, destructive plasticity. But could you give some examples of what you mean when you say destructivity of form as forming its own form? Just so I can maybe wrap my mind around what that means.
Well, this is one of the instances when I regret not mentioning Sabine Spielrein enough. psychoanalyst who is claimed to be Russian, but I claim that she's Ukrainian. She wrote paper Destruction as Cause of Coming into Being, 8 years before Freud, Beyond the Pleasure Principle, where she introduces the death instinct or the death drive. And well, judging from the title of the paper, Destruction as the Cause of Becoming. So she was the one who recognized destruction as formation, as formative. And it's very similar with this concept of destructive plasticity, seeing destructiveness or destruction as the transformative, as a core of transformation, and formation not as opposite to not the opposite of destruction. And here it's even psychological. When we talk about destruction and when we talk about formation of psyche, of anything that is coming into being, we tend to emphasize formation, and we see destruction as something secondary. And even in a very banal neuroscientific concepts or concept that concern plasticity of the brain, we tend to emphasize the crucial role of the central role of those processes of formation and generation, seeing anything that has to do with destruction either as secondary or not considering it at all. But my point is, and Sabina Spielrein point is, even if it's a point, I'm not sure, that destruction, at least as experiment, can be seen as the central and maybe even the only one. So formation would be seen, or generation, or something that coming into being would be seen as a not deviation, but secondary and maybe not even necessary thing. So, and it presupposes also, maybe Adorno would say, thinking against thought, because this is how thought works. It sees this generative positive phenomena on every level of especially in science as central. And I was trying to work against thought in this book to show not to end up in emphasizing as central those positive generative phenomena.
Yeah, I think it's super important what you're pointing at, whether or not it's a point. But I think it's super important. I mean, I just want to maybe offer some personal examples that might, I don't know, make it at least more concrete or comprehensible to myself. Is I noticed when I analyzed the history of my family, that all of the positive organization of the family, on both sides, seem to come as a result of crucial deaths. So like when a crucial member of the family died, the positive organization can't survive that death. And the resulting organization or the resulting form of the family is kind of a response to that whole of the death. And this has happened several times. And I would even say, in regards to my life, when I fundamentally failed at something, like not just a little bit, like not like a little failure where I could keep going, but a failure where it's the end of the line, those were the moments where I was properly thrown into new form. Like the two major times it happened was in the transition from me trying to be an athlete to becoming an academic, and then probably trying to then another transition in trying to become an academic professor versus trying to do something online. But in both situations, there was a reaching the end of a line where there was just a destruction, basically. But so I resonate with this. I think it's worth thinking about this very deeply.
So it basically was elaborate answer on my question whether you're a failure. Thank you.
Right.
It's true, because every human life we tend to not sure it's in our culture, maybe that's how human thinking works, but we tend to see these positive outcomes of any negativity, of any failures that we encounter, or even death of someone, which is the hardest one, as or failure of relationship, for example, that look at the bright side, what are the good outcomes of it, or you learn from your mistakes and you're gonna do better next time, or something like that. But it's the end, that something ended, it would never be restored. You're traumatized. After the traumatized mean you are never coming back to who you used to be. Or maybe you will you will have some what is called healthier relationship or something like that in the future, but it's not it doesn't compensate in any way the death of those, or trauma of those relationships. It's not that even it's a new you, it's some kind of different form of death that you now embody. So it's not like we tend to present our lives as whatever bad will happening, there is, you can learn something from it, there might be positive outcomes, and the death of someone, of course, is the hardest one, but we manage, we'll meet them somewhere in afterlife. But the crucial thing, the bottom line, what is happening, it's just this the series of deaths that we encounter, it's nothing will compensate for anything, it's just forever. And that is formation of you, but you can also say that it's not a formation of you or your life, it's just the destruction that you particularly, or failure that you embody.
I mean, I'm definitely, I mean, I think you push this point very far, and it pushes me to the point of the breaking of speech. So that's probably a good thing. This idea of a series of deaths without compensation is a strong notion. What's coming to my mind is I recently had Todd McGowan on the seminars for the Acree, and he was talking about the difference between, and of course Todd's in your work, and hopefully we can go into that as well. But he was talking about this distinction between loss and lack. So when there's these series of deaths without compensation, I feel like it's a framing under this progressive losses. You keep losing things. Versus the perspective of lack, which is that do you think this is what I'm going to try and point towards? Do you think it's a cop out to say that the perspective of lack, in some sense, prepares you for a series of deaths without compensation, that you can endure loss after loss after loss in a different way than if you're kind of blindsided, like getting hit by a truck without when you walking across the street, you get blindsided type of thing. I'm not sure if my question is clear, but it's just this difference between loss and lack is what he was trying to highlight.
Yeah, and I don't do it in my book. I just use loss and lack interchangeably, even though, well, it's kind of obvious that when there is loss, it's meaning that you lost something that was unity, or, well, something is lost. And lack is just primordial, you can say lack and nothing was lost. But I use them interchangeably because, there's this psychoanalytic trick that I like, is that there's loss, but it's loss of nothing. So it's basically a lack. And even if we have illusion that something, we place this having of something that was lost in a past, it's still an illusion that we can never, it never happened in the past, and you'll never get it in the future. It's a beautiful thing about psychoanalysis. So it's the loss is always lack. And maybe the goal of my thinking, if there is any, and the goal of the book is not to prepare into anything. That's why I don't recommend it to people who feel that they're alive. I don't think you're able to prepare for it, and I don't even think that you have to do it, be negative or anything. But I also don't think that it's a choice. But the trauma is trauma precisely because something comes and you're not prepared for it. It's the rupture. You don't know what to prepare for, and no matter how many times you would tell yourself that life is terrible in certain way, you'll still end up traumatized in certain circumstances. So it's impossible to prepare. It's waste of time of preparing, but it's also actually beautiful waste of time. It's like creating mandala, doing something for nothing, just to destroy it.
Yeah, I mean, it's again pushing things very deeply. I mean, the main distinctions I'm getting there is if, the way I was trying to frame it perhaps was, the idea of is there a way to prepare? Maybe that's too imaginary in contrast to what you're trying to point towards, I think, which is just the real of the series of deaths that you'll experience, and there's no way to get out of the real of the traumas that you'll experience in those moments.
Yeah, maybe it's just the perspective that I'm offering, and I'm offering it to people who actually already know about it. Because if you have illusion that, for example, traumas can be healed, that something you can come into some kind of state of coherence after trauma. That's what we normally believe within therapeutic society. They would say that I'm too negative and that there is a bright side of life, and I encounter it a lot. But just this is the perspective I'm trying to stay within. Some reason, genuinely seeing life as a series of deaths without any possibility of salvation, without any possibility of treatment, and even we can question the very idea of treatment or healing or coming from point A to point B, whereas improvement, what kind of improvement if you're going to die at the end, for example? It's one of the terrible things. There are lots of many other terrible things. For example, anything we have or anyone we have in our life, we already lost them. They exist in a mode of us missing them as already lost. Not only at the end we are losing life and losing others, important others, but they exist as already lost. It's already lost, or we are already dead, we can say. And this is the perspective that I'm trying to stay faithful to. One might ask why. I don't know why. One might also say that it's kind of some kind of deviation or trauma response or something like that. But also it's bias that why people who are not traumatized, some kind of happy and healthy and smart, are only ones who are supposed to talk. Why is it their opinion that matters? And if you sad and traumatized, you're suddenly not allowed to talk, or not, at least not from the space of trauma. It's like we aim to silence it. Don't know why, maybe because it's hard to stay within this place, but there is this tendency that one can feel when you try to be faithful to this position. People will try to rescue you.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree, and I've experienced it myself on several occasions. I'm trying to think about how difficult I suppose it would be to imagine a conference or to imagine a social event, or even any word I come up with is already too positive if I think about like a festival or a around this in a sense. I suppose one of the things that's coming to my mind though is what you might get a lot, like you were pointing at, is people trying to psychologize or psychoanalyze you. Like what, why this faith to negativity? Why keep going with this? Yeah, what's your reaction when people try to turn around your faith, or try to turn around your perspective, and try to seek some way to positivize it?
Well, I do understand them because it's what people do, some kind of maybe naturally. And I'm also I'm not persuading anyone. I'm also quite scared of myself, and I also have a tiny bit of hope that people will persuade me in the opposite. But they well, something is too strong in me, this negative core, to that my devotion, some kind of weird thing. And I can also psychoanalyze them. That's just what I do. Why they're trying to stay positive, or why there's this is reaction. There is this reaction on me of trying to cheer me up or escape from it or heal me or cure, provide some kind of cure. So we're psychoanalyzing each other in our own way. But I do understand the intention, and I also might have right now I think I lost it completely because precisely of some people that I persuaded in my perspective and terrifies me, instead of rescuing me, dragging people into a more depressive state. And it's interesting, yes, to imagine a space or conference, and this is what I'm trying to create, or at least not create. It's not that I'm trying to make people depressed and like be with me in my cult or something like that. It's just I'm there for people who fail, who are failures, who are not able to get back into the positive perspective, which is considered normal functioning of psyche. I just there, and I love this place, and I'm not able to maybe go back into the place of positive illusion because I don't recognize it as genuine. And I can only tolerate human relationship or psychoanalytic practice as within this space. It's the only one that I find genuinely human, the space of disillusionment where we're not trying to fix each other, cheer each other up, or try to be normal. And I'm exploring what is here, what can we do with each other. And it's not, I wouldn't imagine this space, for example, a space of depression where we complain. Even the word depression, it presupposes that it's the diagnosis and something that has to be fixed. If you claim you have depression, it's Todd McGowan actually point, and the way he used to deal with his depression, not anymore. Because if you call it depression, if you claim that you have depression, it means that you are asking to be saved. It's not what I'm talking about. It's not the depression that is diagnosis that qualifies you for certain cure. It's just that depression. That's it. As with no escape. So, and it's also not people who are complaining, because complaining still presupposes a hope that something goes wrong. It's just no complaining. It would probably space where people laugh and cry at the same time, inadequate space, but that's the space of human connection that I like, that I love, that I genuinely feel I belong to, or the space, where there's nothing positive left to do with each other. This is the space where you end up. It's similar to the certain rituals of mourning other people, and there are people who have dysfunction during funerals to mourn, so they just cry, right, without any this cry or the mourning. It doesn't presuppose that you can fix something. It's not the therapist who is fixing. Of course, we can claim that there is a positive function to this procedure of other people crying and feeling sad for just intentionally, but I prefer to see core of it as just meaningless, and I like it this way.
I mean, I was going to reflect a little bit on the personal experience of, one, the resistance to cry sometimes inside myself, but also the process of crying actually being paradoxically enjoyable in a sense, like where I do feel a certain like bodily stress relief. Like I do feel like I again using the words that come up, I'm like, always, should I use that word? That the therapeutic of crying. I have experienced it, but the overall point here you're saying of this, one, just emphasizing care and care for laughing and crying is, care in a space where laughing and crying can occur, to me is it does point in a genuine space, because there's something about laughing and crying which is totally uncontrollable in my experience. Like you laugh almost without even you didn't anticipate that you were going to laugh, or you didn't anticipate that you're going to cry. Crying and laughing happens. But another place where I wanted to point at a connection of common experience is being shocked at the results of your own philosophy, or being shocked at the results of your own disposition with the other. Like I've had experiences of how do I make sure that my work doesn't lead to potentially suicide, or how do I make sure that my work doesn't, this is just, things I think about, and have worked through. Have you had what's your experience with that process and that experience?
Yeah, I know we all scared with the limits of our responsibilities, but I'm quite brave in taking responsibilities even for horrifying, unexpected. I mean, I feel like I have nothing to lose, but it's not that I'm not afraid of suicide. Other people, because this is not what I'm approving of. For me, suicide, it's too positive. It's still, you need a lot of hell of motivation for suicide, and it's still a solution, a certain solution of radical solution. So the death that I'm not advocating, but trying to understand sincerely, was I'm trying to rescue, is opposite rather from. So it's more, in certain ways, more horrifying that suicide. It's more depressing, even. So I'm not trying to make people commit suicide. I'm either not trying to make them more depressed. I'm not trying anything at all. I'm not motivated enough. I'm just failed in a certain space of depression. I'm not necessarily trying to get out, exploring it. And I encountered lots of people over here within this space who are also not necessarily want kind of treatment, but also explore it and also discover a certain human bond in it, and space that I'm faithful to, and no matter probably the consequences.
I keep getting this feeling of, and this is, I guess, a word I'm taking from Alenka Zupancic a little bit, but and maybe the series, the Short Circuit series of books, but this idea that your work short circuits language in some sense. Like there's a lot of words which I feel like a lot of words we use very often in psychoanalytic circles, that your work short circuits, that your work disrupts in some sense. Have you had that experience?
This is what attracts me in psychoanalysis, the different use of language. And psychoanalysis wouldn't hide this speech that works as a disruption. It has more tolerance for it, unlike in science or even in philosophy, certain types of philosophy, or in common, within the space of a common sense. When we want clarity, when we don't want disruption, when we have the illusion that speech can explain something, that those ruptures of a speech or some kind of paradoxes or absurd speech, that it's something to avoid. Psychoanalysis is attractive to me precisely because it allows more space for it, but still there is the other side of psychoanalysis as a treatment understood within a therapeutic culture, is precisely something that has to be efficient, cure, or scientific enough. And again, there are those two sides, but the one I'm attracted to, the side, is the one with the rupture that allows paradoxes. But still, I got more and more disillusioned with this kind of psychoanalytic speech, with psychoanalytic language. Why are we doing this? And in general, the value of a speech, even the speech that disrupts itself, even the one with paradoxes, and the whole maybe sphere of the space of philosophy and psychoanalysis. And it's interesting. Well, it was very hard to write this book precisely for this reason, because I'm trying to contradict the speech. I'm trying to contradict the language, try not to go where it goes, but why am I even using it anyways? And I'm not sure where to move from here, and if there needs space to move from here, except for just crying, and that's it. And not in a way crying the way you mentioned it, because, well, partially, because when you mention it and when we normally talk about it, we place it in the perspective of treatment, like because the crying ends, we feel relief, we tend to think to substitute this end, to see the end or relief as the goal of crying. But no, what if the opposite? What if it's all crying? Just sometimes we feel rest from it. Or what if the whole life is this tragedy, and sometimes what we feel like goal or of the tragedy as certain relief, happiness? What if it's just temporary break for prepare for other, or like sleep from the tragedy of existence, from the crying and laughter of existence. It's glitching. In certain sense, actually, laughter and crying can be seen as the operation of a death drive, but it's different topic.
I mean, maybe the way I was framing crying was too object oriented on the end point as opposed to the process of crying itself. I'm also taken by the way you're thinking about the community of speech or the community of language that orients around maybe perhaps the Freudo-Lacanian tradition, but I suppose it happens in all traditions. You know, you say, why are we doing this? Why are we reifying certain languages? Why are we reifying certain forms of speech? And at the same time, when I'm reading your book, one of the things I appreciated about your book was the way in which you situated the death drive within a tradition of thought, where there is a continuity of sorts, a lineage of sorts. So how should we think through this paradox, which I myself share, you know, I'm unsure how to think this myself.
I don't know.
Yeah.
I just like the concept, and I think I have my own reading or using this perspective, negative perspective. I have my own perception of a certain, and I discover through this perception, through this angle of view, a certain continuity. But I think it's very subjective. To be honest, it's not that I discovered and did research on the actual continuity. I'm really much like Sabina Spielrein, and it's quite injustice, her idea of death instinct and her negative insight. And it's extremely unjust that some of her thoughts that we would normally even not mention her when we talk about death drive, and we would put it completely through into perspective of Freudian tradition, of like I did in my book, of early Freud and late Freud, without mentioning her, even though she was a disruption of his thought, of psychoanalytic thought. She was this glitch, she caused this glitch of psychoanalysis that I find this glitch of psychoanalysis, the only psychoanalysis that I like. So it's not continuity, it just the discontinuity rather, and very subjective perspective.
Well, to be fair to you, you do mention the paper, but perhaps there should have been more attention to her work. But it is mentioned in the work. Moving on to the social dimension of your work. I mean, I think the thing that strikes me is how difficult it is to think the death drive in society, and yet perhaps that's imminent. You mention how every political project is tied to a positive good, that we can't think about politics, or it's very difficult to think about politics outside of that sort of precondition. Where are you now with thinking about death drive and society and politics and the interrelations between these notions?
Well, I still think that I'm trying to think of death drive as social, and to be honest, you can see after reading the second chapter where I present, following Todd McGowan, death drive as a social concept. from this point of view, the first chapter you might see as a mistake because it only mentions individual, and it's like pretends that there is individual and that's it, and then we kind of connect to each other. But the core is of everything is, so it's quite very individualistic. And I'm correcting this mistake in second chapter, trying to, and it's my goal even outside of the book, to quite feminist, by the way, to see not only self as interrelational, but first as relationship bond, social bond, and then as individual. And maybe you can also say that it's self as illusionary, so non-individualistic thinking. And to think about sociality as maybe core, or and individual self is something more illusionary. But also arguing that both are illusion, following McGovern too in this chapter. But this chapter, second chapter, engages with the concept of the death drive as social, as something that not only forms us, the core of a self, meaning self is already post-traumatic, self is traumatized at the beginning, or there is no beginning to it, but it's also the death drive or suffering, or the repetition of loss or lack, as constitutive to the bond between us, and the suffering at the bottom of love, for example. And trying to see it at the core of social bond, and also at the core of any social projects, including political projects, as a mechanism of self-sabotage, that no matter, even if on external some kind of level, we pretend that we have positive aim in mind, and we work towards the positive aim, like certain improvement in society, or positive project of psychology of let's cure everyone and we're all going to be healthy and our relationship going to be psychologically healthy. That's fashionable right now. And other positive goals, or education maybe. The core is still self-sabotage, and the repetition of lack or repetition of nothing. That is death drive.
I mean, there's a number of interesting points of connection that I've come across in the last few years in regards to thinking about community models under I mean, I guess they're Lacanian, like they often proposed as Lacanian community models of loss or lack as a constitutive bond. Recently on the seminars for the ACRI, we had Peter Rollins talking about the Church of Contradiction, and he was talking about the idea of a religious gathering around a giant black hole. This image to me has stuck in my mind as incredibly powerful. But what I see this all pointing towards is sort of a political or a theopolitical model, which is not trying to sublate in some sense, which is not trying to make any form of incremental or larger sense of progress, but simply being with, or I don't even know if integrating lack is the right word, but certainly accepting lack. What language would you use?
The other thing about this book is I'm trying not to at least offer any reply answer to question what to do or how to improve anything or how it should be, including embracing lack. I hope maybe I do, but at least at the end I'm taking this hope of offering what to do for any kind of improvement. And this is precisely working against thought, because thought is aimed, human thought or just thought in general, probably aimed at improvement. And I'm just glitching all the way in the book. And I love idea of the negative core and the sacrifice as something that structures society, embracing, we can say, the negativity, the loss or the lack. But it's not something that we have to do. it's like whatever we encounter, the core, what is already happening, the destruction, the repetition of destruction of luck. We escape right away there, claiming that this is what we have to do, and you're already doing it, right? That's like escape from the very recognition of what is happening. And the repetition of rituals, the foundational of or any society, what McGovern beautifully calls the establishment of nothingness, or the repetition of it that exists in every society and is foundational for social bond. It exists anyway, but somehow claiming that we have to do it, we have to embrace it, even there is no escape from not doing it, somehow makes us feel better. Like, but again, it's like this mandala, you created it with being conscious that it's for nothing, that you have to repeat it. Even calling it beautiful the way I'm calling it, just already escape. There is some positive meaning to it, whether there is no positive meaning. It doesn't imply what to do, unfortunately, even if one really wants to. But we do feel it as genuine, and we do want to, this urge to say that there is something that has to be done when this recognition is, even if it's a recognition, happen, but there is nothing to be done. It just we don't have control, I think, of it, and we don't have to have control of it. I'm not sure. Well, there is nothing that we have to do, anyways.
Do you see your viewpoint as synergistic or aligned with any spiritual or religious traditions in particular? I know there are many spiritual and religious traditions which have various structural roles for nothing, or placing nothing as of a primary importance. Yeah, do you have any resonance with any spiritual or religious traditions?
Yeah, I think it was all of them and was none of them at the same time, because as I said, at least from my perception, I can recognize this negative course in any religion, any phenomena. With Buddhism, which I aesthetically don't like in a Western interpretation. There's something wrong when a Western person tries to use it. But in Christianity, in Greek mysteries, I think if one wants, and I do want to, if you want to, you can see the negative part, like in Christianity, apophatic, for example, Christianity. Well, even apophatic Christianity, this apophatic non-knowledge would be presented as a certain stage to or something more substantial than this knowledge. Whether the truth is that it's just the end of that's the end, no knowledge, and that's it. So it's also glitching at the core. In Christianity, so you have, but the profane Christianity, the positive one, you have salvation and you have all the escape mechanisms you need. In Buddhism is similar. In Greek Eleusinian mysteries, you would also have lesser mysteries where you improve, get certain knowledge, you get initiated in certain knowledge, but also greater mysteries. So the inner mysteries would be rather the absence of any knowledge, the absence of coherency, negative. And so in psychoanalysis, I think a similar way, if you want to find escape from it, you'll find escape from in love also. I think there is the negative core, at least I have this perception. I'm able to see it as the negative core and as the positive escape from the core. So in this way, it's connected to not only any religion, any spiritual thing, but also to anything. It's a universal depressive perspective.
Okay, so even beyond the depressive realist, there's no realist illusions here. But maybe moving on to the third part where you talk about nature, evolution, and monsters. I guess here again, where the positive, and just to maybe bring sort of some, should I say, coherence to the podcast. that there's a string throughout the three sections of your work: the individual, the social, and natural, which is again bringing us to the structure of death and negativity. And I guess this positive spin in nature, this positive spin in evolution, is something you frame as emerging in the teleological narrative of life triumphing over death, or life somehow some positive variation, some positive selection process in Darwinian concept. How are you framing evolution in contrast to this more common stylization?
Evolution is another great example of this positivity and negativity, because on one hand, there is lots of disillusionment in establishment of a very idea of evolution, of Darwin's perception of evolution, considering especially that Darwin was Christian, and for him it caused a great depression to discover what he discovered, because he was deeply embedded into Christian worldview, and discovering evolutionary principle for him was rupture of this thinking, even though I would claim, and not only me, that there is still lots of Christian illusions in evolutionary theory, precisely because it's still positively aim of some kind of improvement, maybe not ethical, and maybe humans are not similar, not semblance of God anymore, just on the level of all the, in certain ways, on the level of all the animals undergoing certain, all the species undergoing certain mechanical changes. But there is still idea of improvement, evolvement we associated with going somewhere forward. Same as in Christianity, there is the hierarchy of beings with a human being at the top, and Darwin still believed on moral, for example, superiority of humans. So there is lots of positive, progressive Christian in this way in evolutionary theory, but there is other tragic, the way I call it, the theory of evolution. And when, for example, entropic theory of evolution, the one Gould represents, where evolution can be seen not as a progress, but as the, again, series of death, meaningless destructiveness that operates in each creature is not the improved version of a previous version of a species, but just certain type of mutation, a certain type of failure that is going to not only individually we're going to die, but any species, existing species, are going to die. So it's just the play of death and destruction, not only individual, but also on a larger scale. And that's the sad, tragic story of evolution that I'm trying to present.
I think there with Gould, you're talking about the punctuated equilibrium point of view, where there's just these like, for example, the 5 major mass extinctions throughout evolution, which have no teleological purpose or larger aim.
Yeah, so when Darwin still too much positive, even though there's lots of disillusionment with Christian perspective, because one of the reasons, because he didn't take into his perspective catastrophical events, like anything species can be improved to, or we can say that they're improving through the undergoing process of selection, even though I would also argue that there is no improvement. Selection is not improvement. It doesn't exist the way we think. We prefer to think that it works, like species evolve, they improve, and the fetus survive. It's not about that. But even with this perspective, any catastrophe, any catastrophical event happens, and no matter how improved you are, you still, for no reason, you just extinct, and who will survive? They will survive, and that's it. And that's something that remains. This is what evolution would work with. So it's the disruption of the idea of improvement that evolution represents.
Yeah, no, this is a complex topic, and the literature here is very interesting. but I agree with your point that, and it's actually, I think, an undervalued point of view that you say there's Christian illusion still in the evolutionary theory. I personally encountered this in regards to people inscribing evolutionary theory into modern technological theory and pointing towards some sort of rapturous technological singularity, for example, that basically technology replaces Jesus, or technology replaces the rapture, or some event, some end times situation where we're all saved instead into supernatural world, into a technologically created world. But it seemed to me like it was Christian illusions appearing in the evolutionary worldview, which I thought was within the communities themselves, they don't really recognize this. But I think it's important you're bringing it up.
It's similar like to personal life you were mentioning, and neuroscientific concept of brain plasticity we're talking about. It's always similar in the theory of evolution. Wherever we encounter positive formation, whatever we can present as improvement, as a progress, we see it as central. But the opposite point of view, a sad one, and Darwin was actually extremely depressed person. Not sure it's after his discovery, he just was that way. Or maybe one needs to be depressed to come up with something, being Christian, come up with something that contradicts the idea of you deeply, deeply love and believe. But he had this terrible social anxiety, and he wasn't able to present socially his ideas. He was throwing up for a couple of days after any social encounter. So the depressive, but he's still not depressive enough. So this perspective that sees and destructive elements as crucial, like it just, someone just dies and it doesn't, or something just dies, or something just for no reason stops existing, and then maybe no improvements following from it, but we can present it as improvement. So it's artificial secondary perspective. Or it can be seen as artificial and secondary and unnecessary perspective. Everything, human life, not everything, well, everything, human life and the brain plasticity, evolution can be presented as the series of deaths and the series transferability or different phases of death and destruction. Nothing good, progressive, and no improvement following from it. Just different variability of monstrosity, and that's it. Or variability of how lack or loss or catastrophe manifests itself. And the perspective with improvement and progress is just secondary, can be seen as secondary and artificial if one wants to. But some reason we don't want to.
Well, it seems to me like we don't want to brings us to this distinction between desire and death drive as opposites, that if the psyches considering the intellectual topic are themselves operating under a model of desire, then they want a positive object for their desire. And it seems like, correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems to me like your intellect has, and you use the word faith, but your intellect has a certain faith to the negativity, a faith that you are embodying the death drive as such in your intellectual project. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, thank you.
maybe it's still too positive, maybe. But
actually,
yeah.
Desire is very hard to concept for me to think and to put within this perspective, maybe because it contradicts and even drive. To be honest, it's self-contradictory. Death drive. It's not a drive. It's Schopenhauer's influence and instinct too. It's something that drives, something that moves forward, even if it's destructive, even if it's moves towards its own end. But it still works as a motivation. And I was trying to conceptualize it's nothing like that. And maybe it's still, I'm okay with encountering a failure. At least I tried, and maybe there is no other outcome of it except for failure. Now I know it, yay, success. But there are certain contradictions you're not able to escape with once you're talking, especially writing book, especially separating out on certain chapters and tracing something from there. But I was trying to avoid as much as possible certain psychoanalytic concepts which are considered central, but for me they are not just secondary. I just avoid them for the reason that they bring different logic, the logic that I don't like. That's the sexuality, anything to do with sexuality and with pleasure, and especially with pleasure, because it brings the problems to to my perspective. And if you consider, for example, or drive or wish or desire, something like that, something that has the idea of motivation aimed at pleasure, if you bring anything that has to do with pleasure at the end, you're not able to talk properly about suffering. And it's the well-known phenomena of masochism, for example. One of the forms, it's what Catherine Malabou criticizes Freud for considering death drive, reducing it in certain context to the masochism, because masochism, like, and Jewish sons too, it presupposes automatically whenever you talk about suffering, certain pleasure. It's like it's aimed for either it's aimed for pleasure or it has a part of the that is pleasurable to it, and you're not able to properly talk about suffering that doesn't resolve into pleasure. And I was trying to avoid just mechanically, not to even Todd McGowan, when he talks about death drive, for him it's a mechanism that allows pleasure or enjoyment, rather enjoyment. I was trying to avoid all the positive and just come up with the concept of human and nature, maybe, and society, that without mentioning it. The really depressive one without any pleasurable outcomes. Just trying not to, because it's a way, it's a certain path that rescues us from, when we talk about pain, we somehow end up using those concepts into resolution of resolving it using the concept of pleasure. I was trying not to do it.
Yeah, it's difficult. Like you say, it's like as soon as you're writing, sometimes it's or as soon as you're in symbolic and trying to express it, sometimes it's hard to escape language which tends in this direction or is always already under some sort of model in this direction. But I like the way you have a tendency to bring it to the personal. I know you did that in your conversation with Catherine Malabou and Todd McGowan and Alenka Zupancic on your channel, and I really enjoyed that. What was your idea in writing the book to have 3 chapters where you're in direct conversation with the theorists that you're influenced by? Because that is, to my mind, an innovative step. It's not something that you see very, very often in academic texts.
Or maybe it's just lack of creativity. But
some destructive event.
Yeah, I just love those people, but I have my own reading of those people. And they not necessarily would agree with my reading of them, but that's my version, the way I love their theory. I'm trying to present it. If there are people who are interested and who share my love, they're welcome to see them through this perspective. But it's actually what I do with any philosopher, theorist I encounter. I just have my certain weird perception of them. But it was interesting to impose during the presentation of book to actually directly impose it on them and see that it works, that they were using my perception of them themselves, helping me kind of trick that I did, redirecting their thinking in a way I would prefer to see their thinking, just having fun, depressive fun.
Right. I mean, in let's maybe go into each in turn. With Catherine Malibu, she's very interested in this intersection between psychoanalysis and neuroscience. Um, Maybe we could go into where do you have a resonance with her? Where do you differ from her perspective? I mean, you've already sort of pointed towards that you're trying to revolutionize the notion of destructive plasticity. Is that sort of where your mind goes with her work?
Yeah, the other fun part actually in the book that I'm trying to present Zizek and Catherine Malabou as living dead, as a product of destructive plasticity, just as an example. But it actually, I think, works well. So it's possible at least to do it. And this is what, it's not that I don't agree with her. It just, maybe I'd prefer to think the way she thinks, but I'm still trying to see the death drive as universal, meaning I'm trying to take a position of, first of all, myself from as a product of destructive plasticity. And for Catherine Malabou, it's more that there is a group of people who are the products of destructive plasticity, whose self is post-traumatic self, and those who are unfixable, those whose self is a product of trauma. And we normally tend to, I respect her position a lot, because it is true that in some sense, it's true that we need to have a different perspective, not positive perspective, of analyzing, talking about people who are not subject of treatment, who won't be, and whose self is a product of trauma, who cannot be rescued in the conventional sense of the world. Because the only right now conventional perspective that exists is that the perspective of treatment. Even in psychoanalysis, if you cannot be, well, conventional psychoanalysis, if you're not subject to cure, you just don't exist outside of it. You're some kind of secondary figure. You fell out of. And we do need negative language to talk about those people respectfully. But I'm also recognizing the importance of this position, this distinction. I'm also trying to see everyone, starting from myself, as a product of destructive plasticity, because I don't like, well, there is something wrong with the position of theorist, of philosopher who is writing about others, especially traumatized others. I'm a healthy person, which presupposes explicitly not the product of trauma, and I will write something about those traumatized ones as trying to fix them or improvement, or but it's just the place that you occupy. You're not, it's not that there's superiority in it, but it's from a different place that I'm trying to get access to. I'm trying to see it as universal. And as an example, I'm using Zizek and Catherine Malabou presenting as living dead, or the product of destructive plasticity. For example, with Catherine Malabou, she dedicates her book on destructive plasticity to her grandmother, who died and who suffered from Alzheimer. And obviously, so she was, it's more, in a more obvious ways, the product of destructive plasticity, the way she changed, the way her old self was lost, and there is never, and something that would never be restored, this loss that she embodies, the product of the death drive, product of certain ways, trauma in certain understanding. But Catherine Malabou too, she is traumatized. Obviously, this book is trauma of encountering this. It's also death of her in certain ways. But so this is Catherine Malabou's example. With Zizek, it's much easier because Zizek writes, he sometimes takes this position with talking about others as victims, as death, the living dead, but sometimes he does includes himself into this perspective. For example, he would talk a lot the way he's depressed, and the only thing that the reason of his surviving his trauma of well, personal trauma is writing book, and that's how we have so many Zizek books. So we can say that there is no Zizek anymore. It's only those trauma response in the form of his amazing books that we have that Zizek. That's the only form of Zizek, that the genuine form of Zizek that exists. So I think they already represent, and we can see that it's obviously, not obviously, we can talk about them as a living dead product of destructive plasticity, just a little push of perspective that was needed, I think, to represent them in this way.
Yeah, I mean, you sort of beat me to the next question, because I love that I loved your references to Zizek as an example of destructive plasticity, where he's like, I wanted to commit suicide, but I needed to finish the text. And then there were just this endlessly deferred suicide. I need to write another book. I need to write another book. I need to write another book. So there's this, yeah, it's a very very powerful inclusion of Zizek into this theory. I liked it a lot. I guess then moving on to Todd McGowan, you talked to him about society, and actually the part of your conversation with Todd that struck me the most powerfully was when he was talking about his own twin sons. I thought it was both horrifying and hilarious when he was talking about his sons trying to bring him down to a low level, or like insult him or mock him. And specifically, he said on becoming a parent, that becoming a parent is like suicide. I was wondering what you thought about this in regards to your theory and family, maybe to talk about family as such in this model.
Yeah, I think for him it's more terrible to encounter that he's not appreciated by his sons, because his sons are university students. So they have a certain level of intellect, when you probably hope that when they reach this level, they will start to appreciate it. But no, it got only worse. With my daughter, it's hard, but it's easier in that way because she's teenager and can blame on, she's not there yet. But then later you probably see that they're never there yet. And children are those who are your most immediate environment. And if you're not appreciated by your immediate environment, any other environment, no matter how much famous you are, it just doesn't matter when you're someone you gave birth to, and someone who's supposed to, for someone who is always there, they don't appreciate you, and they think, in general, that philosophy is something stupid, which I agree, but I never thought it would be directed against me. So children are traumatizing in this way. And it's not only for philosophers. I think it's kind of weirdly obvious for philosophers, but in this way, but also very parenthood and motherhood is, one can see as a trauma, even though it's another impact of Sabina Spielrein, her perspective as a destruction. We tend to see it as life-giving, as nurturing all the positive things, but it can also be seen as a certain form of death, of suicide. And Sabina Spielrein also, I think, compares pregnancy, for example, with cancerous tumor as also something destructive going on when you sacrifice your life to a new life, which is also doesn't compensate necessarily the sacrifice of your life, and it's not a continuity of it. It's actually rupture and a genuine sacrifice, because you do it for nothing. You would, if you get recognition or some kind of your children are grateful to you, you're not doing it, I think, well, maybe later sometime. But you're not doing it for them to be grateful. They're not supposed to. And it's impossible to be completely grateful, because if you give your life to them, meaning to pay fully, you need to give the life back, which just doesn't make sense. Well, nothing makes sense actually, but in parenthood it's extremely obvious, the way it's painful and the way it's unfair and the way it's supposed to be unfair, and it doesn't result in any successful project. You just let them go, and if it's not project that is oriented towards its end or rupture or subversion of itself, you're not doing it right. You are abusive or something like that.
Yeah, no, I love that point. I mean, I maybe even labor on this point a little bit. I think that it's not said enough, actually, that if you're parenting in such a way as that you're not letting them go at a certain point, like you say, you're not doing it right. I think that's one end of parenting which is not really understood in our society. But then the other end of I guess what often I think a lot of people are talking about is like the collapse or the decline in reproduction rates, is that parenting is a type of suicide. Parenting is a type of sacrifice for nothing, like you're saying. And when we're thinking about a death drive driven society, how do you think we would frame or talk about these issues of parenting and having children, taking these more negative aspects into consideration?
Well, I don't think we have to do it. I think they're there at the core, and we can just come up with positive allusions to necessary, maybe even to suffer parenthood to the logical end, if there is any end to it. And when you discover the core of parenthood, unfair and traumatic, it's traumatizing. It's very hard to bear. So we come up with ideas that not come up, but the general framework would be that we do give life the positive things. There is nothing traumatic, just ways to cover the trauma of what is actually happening. But one can present the core of parenthood in a negative way as traumatic without any cure to it, as at its core, and with just some ways, illusionary ways of escaping this core. But actually, the trauma is at the core of this type of social bond.
Yeah, I guess there's always slipping into a tendency of, oh, we have to do something about it. Like I'm framing that in some of the questions, but what I'm getting in yours is less an emphasis on our agency and maybe more a sort of an acceptance of that core.
Still, acceptance is something that we have to do, but maybe maybe to just be able to be parents, we have to and encountering that traumatic part of it, we have to run away from it, escape it into even idea that we have to embrace this core. Just, it's traumatic no matter you escaping it, and you're not escaping. It's traumatic and unfair at its bottom, and hoping that it can resolve into something, or it's probably helps to bear it, withstand it to a certain extent. But I wouldn't say that we have to recognize it. It's terrifying to be recognized.
I think on just on a personal level, I think the thing I struggle the most with all of these things is the unfairness, the injustice. I mean, I come to it. I recognize it in a sense that I know that's the real or something like that. But it's still hard to, I guess it's hard to move with that. There's something that resists. I guess it's the child throwing a tantrum in some sense of like it's unfair, but
tantrums is another instance can be seen as tantrums of my daughter when she was a toddler was actually inspiration, so to say, for the idea of a death drive. I didn't have much experience with children before I encountered the stage of being a toddler. With the tantrums, it's like actually the human being you just gave life to, and the precious life is actually trying to commit suicide for no reason. Like the sandwich is wrong, is the wrong shape or something like that, completely absurd, and actually trying to kill himself. And of course, for some reason we laugh at this, and we think diminishing that children are not real human beings. They pretend to kill themselves, or they pretend to suffer. But what if it's actually they do suffer? To imagine growing up doing it. but it's just horrifying to witness a kid, and we do have to diminish their the impact of their even being actual human beings to just withstand the absurdity of what is happening. But if you're a philosopher, it's quite hard to like when you're not doing it, when you respect the child the way you respect adult. That's what I was doing. That was tough to witness in the same time, ridiculous and traumatized.
Yeah, I can only imagine because I don't have kids, but all I have is a point of reference of myself as a child. And unfortunately, I can report that I remember throwing a tantrum because we don't get to have hot dogs tonight, or the crust wasn't cut off the sandwich, and just these ridiculous things that you can imagine from the point of view of an adult, let alone the point of view of an adult philosopher, just how insane that would be to put up with. Um, but I guess let's finally move on to Alenka, who is your doctoral supervisor, and your conversation with her, where you're not only bringing in evolution but also Nietzsche and Freud in relationship to evolution. Yeah, where do you think Alenka's most helpful for you in thinking about, I suppose, nature and evolutionary thinking?
Well, the way she engages with Nietzsche, and that was first thing that attracted me, why I really wanted her as my supervisor. Her reading of Nietzsche, second through Lacan, but also through herself, through Alenka, that what attracts me. And um, from this perspective, I also used in the third chapter where I see nature as death driven, I used her logic of comprehending Lacan and Nietzsche from the perspective of well, rapture, the universal rapture, and everything driven by rapture. Adding there my favorite philosopher, well, at least he used to be. I don't have any favorite philosophers right now. Peter Wetzel-Zapfe, who is philosophical pessimist, and trying to apply it to perspective of evolution, but also trying to see some of the contemporary research in evolutionary theory, just to support this kind of thought, how everything is based on rupture in evolution, not in progress.
Yeah, I actually wanted to ask you about Peter Wessel Zapf. Is that, how do I pronounce last name, Zapf?
I pronounce it like Zapfe. I don't know if it's
Zapf.
correct.
Right. But you said he's your favorite philosopher, and actually, when I was reading your book, that was the first I've ever encountered his ideas. It might be the first time people listening here are hearing about him as well. So, maybe give an overview. Why is he your favorite philosopher? Because he comes up a few times in your book.
Yes, he's Norwegian philosopher, and when one would talk about depressive realism, philosophical pessimism, that's when he would come up. He wrote essay, the only essay that is famous, Last Messiah, and he comes up to Freud, and he directly criticizes the domain of psychiatry and the other domains of culture as too positively oriented, and he offers this what I call negative insight into how everything sucks and how culture just presents different types of lie to cover the negativity of our existence. But I got disillusioned in him, like in everyone else I once feel deeply in love with, because he's still, for the reason he's still quite positive, as he is offering, we were discussing suicide, but if there's something he's offering, not exactly suicide, he's considered to be anti-natalist, but he just thinks that we supposed to stop reproducing, so kind of suicide, but like moderate version of suicide, and it's still offering a solution, is still trying to heal suffering, because his reasoning is that we suffer so much, we're mistake of nature, that we should stop existing. Well, not our generation, just let not produce other generation. And I think it's still positive solution, treatment of the recognition of that we are mistake of nature. And he mentioned it in a third chapter on nature, that his example is reindeer with overly heavy horns. And this is the analogy for him for the human depression. Like our depression or overly developed consciousness is the mistake of nature that brings us down to earth. We are not able to suffer, to endure it. It's very hard. We need to just stop existing to stop suffering, because we are a mistake of nature in this way. In the same way, this type of reindeers, the Irish reindeers, I think they're called, that extinct because of their overly heavy horns, which were beautiful, but just mistake, that also were bringing them down to the earth. And my claim is that it's even more tragic than that. It's that any species is the mistake of nature, if you want, without any ideal prototype. Is we all mutants and all suffer. It depends how you define suffering, but we all going to extinct, and for one reason or for the other. And he also, this not only his idea that it's also Lacan, we can say, is victim to this reduction of human suffering to overly developed consciousness, and Schopenhauer to idea that we suffer too much precisely because of the consciousness, but at the same time is the quite positive idea, because we feel that we are superior to, yes, we suffer, but especially in Schopenhauer, you can see it how he openly claims that we are superior to other animals precisely because we suffer of the consciousness that makes us suffer more. So at the same time superior, and at the same time the worst mistake, which is it's still too anthropocentric perspective, and it's still suffering that is reduced to consciousness. Not enough in my view to explain it. Still, we can also say that it's male-centered. Not sure about the logic why it's male-centered, but that just take it for granted. But I think suffering much larger than this, and that human not necessarily suffer more. I think we all suffer. Again, depends on definition of suffering. But Lacan's idea, he offers, I think, the opposite view, that at the same time of still going with the idea that consciousness, the rupture from nature is suffering, presupposing that this state of that the idea that Alenka criticizes, this reading of Lacan, that there was once a harmony with nature and then rupture through language and suffering. For Alenka, that's when she brings Nietzsche, that it was always this glitch, was never ideal human or any other animal in harmony with nature. It's the illusion. It was always a rupture. But for me, it's not depressive enough to say, to reduce suffering to consciousness and to say that humans are unique. Mistake is because there is still superiority of this uniqueness. I think it's, well, yes, other Lacan's idea that contradicts this reading is that consciousness, on the contrary, might be seen as a reduction of suffering. At least we're able to feel it or reflect it or put it into words. So the contrary, it might be that nature or those lilies in the valley suffer more precisely because they don't have human type of consciousness. Just as experiment, at least for thought, that humans might suffer less, not more, because they have consciousness. And there is lots more than just the consciousness that defines human, and that can be seen as instance of suffering, if we want to.
All right. Well, coming to the close of our conversation, I do want to talk about the end of the book, No Salvation, where I feel like there's I want to push perhaps a paradox, because whenever you mention someone, you say it's not negative enough. But then at the end of In No Salvation, you also say that you're succumbing to the temptation of consolation and practical advice and stuff like this. So what would you give from this perspective on yourself about what's going on here at the end of what's going on in regards to succumbing to this temptation, I say.
Yeah, the way I frame it, I think it was smart, maybe. But I just listed mistakes that one can deduce from my work, which are also my mistakes. So I listed certain types of something that can be mistaken for practical outcome. And then I said at the end that it's actually all of those that don't work. So there are no consolation. And even if you encounter the thinking, even if it's my own illusion, and I list my favorite illusion, the idea of negative practice, which I actually do, but also understanding that it's probably not probably, but definitely another failure, another subject to disillusionment in a future something. The illusion that I will get lost at the end. So I was trying to contradict the rules of conclusion, not giving any orientation, practical orientation of what we have to do, how something has to be improved, or some kind of consolation, even by listing consolation and taking them away. I was trying to avoid it, maybe failing. But...
Well, so I mean, I think at least in my summary, it was sort of like a consolation or a practical advice for the three major sections, right? The individual, the social, and nature. And in some sense, I can relate to each of them. The individual already being dead, the social sort of being linked to the other's pain, and nature being sort of like this field of charming monsters. Um, what do you think is the relationship between these three dimensions and your negative practice, if there is one?
I'm not sure if there is one, but maybe there is. Well, the quote that I provide, the passage from Freud at the beginning, where he mentions, but I think it's just conventional thing to distinguish three dimensions of suffering as individuals from society and from nature, something like that. So it's quite artificial, but at the same time, it's just manifestation of my love to the concept of a death drive, which I was trying to see everywhere. Wherever I see it. And I represented the product of my creativity in this book. And the most important, I think, illusion that I'm taking away at the end, and maybe throughout the book, an illusion that I'm taking from myself and from depressive realism that I also used to love, and I'm questioning because it's not negative enough. The illusion of superiority. In this book, or the perspective of depressive realism, doesn't give you any kind of superiority over those people who are positively oriented, including myself. I'm taking this. It's painful to take this illusion from myself, that I know now I'm sad, but I know more. But so what? So it's not that I feel superior to people who are positively oriented, or who are easier to perceive as positively oriented, because I think we all negative at the core. It's just illusion of positivity that we're able to maintain. Like my mom, for example, she's a very cheerful person. I think we're just pathetic in different way, like my mom and me equally, but in a different way.
Well, it's fascinating that your mom is a cheerful person. I guess I'd ask, what do I remember my PhD supervisor telling me, because he would always be positive and I would always be negative, and he would attribute it to early childhood. Would you attribute it to early childhood, or would you attribute it to historical encounters with tragedy? Where would you and then I guess maybe bringing that back to you and your mom, what would you say is the difference between you and your mom? Why do you think she's got a positive and you have a negative disposition?
Well, when I was a teenager, I would probably answer that I'm more wise or smart than my mom, and I know how life is, and my mom is too naive. But came to recognize that this, what might seem as a positivity or trying to cheer other people's up the way my mom does with me, including, or maybe at least before, I persuaded her, and now I regret. I'm terrified of my mother being persuaded, and there is no way back. But sometimes what is hidden behind this trying to be happy, even what I hate, but it's a knowledge of trauma. It's a knowledge of the opposite, and it changed my perspective of perception of people who appear to be happy, because it might be the opposite. If you are, if someone is overly happy, not like my mom is okay, but when someone is overly happy, you can see it as the manifestation of trauma. They are escaping from something precisely because they are desperate to escape. It's too much pressure. And our happiness oriented culture might be the result of it, precisely of the opposite that we know. That's why we're so crazy happy oriented sometimes. So it's not necessarily the contradiction. It's not that one position is right, the negative one, and the positive is stupid. They're both stupid.
It's again you're leaving me with a really interesting idea there. In particular, this emphasis on someone who's very overly happy, that it might also be a trauma reaction or a trauma response. That's a little terrifying, but I guess I want to keep going down this rabbit hole. Has your mother read your book?
No, my mother is from Ukraine, and I don't want her to read my book. And my daughter would, she just open it and she thinks that it's too emo, too negative, and she doesn't like it because philosophy is stupid.
Okay. All right. Well, that's interesting. I think it's always interesting to bring in the personal, and I really do appreciate the way you do that in your work, bringing in together the personal and the intellectual. I think it's important to do, and so thank you for that. I guess the final thing is, do you have anything you'd want to let the viewers know about, or future projects that you'd want to inform them about? Of course, I'll leave links in the description to both your website and your book, but you also have a practice, so anything you'd want to let anyone know about.
I have my depressive website where I try to update regularly. And I actually, I mentioned that I regret not mentioning enough Sabina Spielrein. I have chapter forthcoming about her. Well, it's in Russian, and I will translate it. I'm writing it in Russian as a Ukrainian for Russian journal, but compensating it with claiming in this paper that she's Ukrainian. So I'm kind of giving something to Russia, but taking Sabina Spielrein from them. But that's my recent piece that will be translated in English, and my tribute to her, and correcting my mistake of not mentioning her enough.
Well, yeah, we'll make sure. I think I can find a copy of her Destruction as a Cause of Coming into Being. So maybe I'll leave that as a link in the description so we can get Sabina some so the recognition she deserves, maybe after the fact. But it is true. Maybe we should labor on that a little bit. It is true that whenever people talk about the death drive, it's always pointed at the beyond the pleasure principle as sort of the origin of the concept. But like you already mentioned, almost a decade before, there's Sabina's work.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So thanks so much for this conversation. I just would encourage everyone who hasn't yet to pick up a copy of Julie's book, the Negative Psychoanalysis for the Living Dead. And like I said, links in the description to her website and book will be under there. And for everyone still listening, thanks for your time and have a great evening. And thanks, Julie, for coming on.
Thank you for having me.